I hope everybody's having a great morning so far. My name's Alex Stamos. I'm the director of the Stanford Internet Observatory. And you have joined us for a live stream to discuss the newest issue of the Journal of Online Trust and Safety. This is our first special issue on uncommon yet consequential harm. It has been edited by one of our postdoctoral fellows, Ronald Robertson. And we have a really incredible set of research papers that are going to be presented today. Very excited to see them. You're going to hear from the authors themselves about their research into online harms and ways to mitigate them. For you who don't know, Stanford Internet Observatory is an interdisciplinary program of the Stanford Cyber Policy Center. We are dedicated to understanding and mitigating online harms. And one of our big projects in doing so is to try to facilitate this kind of interaction between academia, nonprofits, and industry workers themselves, especially people who work in trust and safety fields in industry. And so that's why we launched this journal, the Journal of Online Trust and Safety, tsjournal.org. And it is also why we are hosting the first of what I expect to be an annual conference called the Trust and Safety Research Conference. This conference is being run by the same team that has put the journal together. A bunch of the presentations in the Trust and Safety Research Conference will be coming out in the next issue of the Trust and Safety of the Journal of Online Trust and Safety at the end of September. The conference is September 29th and 30th here on the Stanford campus. We have 450 seats. We have sold 440 tickets. I know this sounds like I'm trying to sell you something, and I guess I literally am, but there's only 10 tickets left for folks who are not speakers or Stanford students. And so if you are in industry or elsewhere in academia and you want to come to the conference, we might sell out by the end of this live stream. In fact, I'll keep on popping in. We'll just do the live thing and see if we can sell out by the end of this. This is going to be an incredible conference bringing together industry and academia to talk about these incredibly important issues. If you're not able to travel to Stanford, or if you're not able to get a ticket, we'll also be live streaming it on YouTube, at least the main talks, but there's a bunch of side talks that will not be available online, as well as the benefits of all of the hallway con that you can only get when you're physically together. The other thing that's going on at the end of the Trust and Safety Research Conference is we are hosting, again, something that we've done multiple times, which is the Stanford Cybersecurity and Trust and Safety Career Fair. This has been virtual in the past, and now it will be physical. We'll have actual students coming and chatting with folks who are interested in hiring them for security and safety jobs. This is an incredible opportunity to get these very talented young people and to put them on a good path. Instead of them going and building online games or optimizing ad networks, this is your chance to get them to do something productive with their lives. And so if you are in industry and you're hiring people for security or safety rules, I strongly suggest you go to TS Research Conference. There's a link there that you can click through to register for the job fair, or you can look on Twitter at Stanford.io, and we have posted a number of things about the job fair and the conference. Again, only 10 tickets left for the conference. Hope to see you there. It's going to be incredible. Really excited, I should say, we're hosting this at the Trust and Safety Professionals Association, so we really do appreciate their partnership in putting this on. Great. So let's hear from our authors. So I'm going to hand this over to our managing editor, Shelby Grossman, or I'm sorry, to Dan, I think is going to go next, Dan Bateko, one of our staff members and one of the editors of the journal, who's done an incredible job pulling this together. So take it away, Dan.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks everyone for coming today. If you have questions, go ahead and put them into the question and answer module. The authors will be able to answer that during the webinar. Just wanted to start off with a big thanks to David Thiel, Elena Christ, Alex, of course, Jeff Hancock, who's professor of communications at Stanford, Shelby Grossman, our editor, and to the editorial team and reviewers. Of course, also to our amazing copy editors, Eden Beck and Kelly Friel. And then extra special thanks to Robert for putting together this guest edited issue. All of the papers are now online, so you can go to tsjournal.org to check them out, read along. And with that, let's get started. So I'm going to pass it over to Ronald.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everyone. I'm Ronald Robertson, postdoc here at SIO, guest editor of this special issue on uncommon yet consequential online harms. The idea for the special issue stems from a consistent finding from research on online behaviors like the sharing of misinformation, engagement with extremist content, or the posting of hate speech, and it's that they tend to be concentrated among a small number of individuals. Despite the statistical infrequency, though, the social consequences of such behaviors can be substantial, especially for people targeted by or within the social networks of individuals perpetuating them. This observation that human behavior often follows a heavy-tailed distribution is well established, for example, the Pareto principle or 80-20 rule, and it applies to a wide range of behaviors, including the number of web pages that people browse, number of papers that scientists publish, or the number of emails that people receive. In taking note of these patterns, scientists have studied their dynamics, proposed mechanisms for their origins, and identified structural features such as rich clubs, subgraphs of prominent individuals tend to be densely interconnected to help us understand and reason about them. However, in the context of harmful online behaviors, this facet of human behavior has rarely arisen as a focal point. While studies showing the low prevalence of such behaviors have been useful, countering alarmist narratives about misinformation abound or everyone's in an echo chamber, their framing and focus on an average user can minimize the fact that small percentages can still constitute large absolute numbers, and that even a small number of individuals can have the potential for an outsized impact, especially in online settings. This special issue joins recent work by psychologists and behavioral scientists in asking the research community to reconsider how they think about effect sizes, interventions, and heterogeneity. Without such considerations, we may overestimate the impact of the interventions that we design and miss opportunities to evaluate how they might be improved in ways that account for heterogeneous responses or cumulative effects. As noted in the curb cut effect, which posits that laws and programs designed to benefit vulnerable groups, such as disabled or people of color, often end up benefiting all of society, adjusting systems for a small number of individuals can often have positive effects for the entire population. Perhaps the same will prove true here. We hope that this special issue inspires future research in this area and that such research paves the way for a deeper understanding and more effective solutions to uncommon yet consequential online harms. With that, let me introduce the first paper by James Bisbee, Megan A. Brown, Angela Lai, Richard Bonneau, and Joshua Tucker and Jonathan Nagler, titled Election Fraud, YouTube, and Public Perception of the Legitimacy of President Biden. We have now James Bisbee, lead author and a professor at Vanderbilt University. Jim, could you tell us about your method for study and recommendations on YouTube and what you found?
Sure. Thanks for having us. Thanks for inviting me here. Yeah, so we conducted this study back in the fall of 2020 in which we recruited a convenient sample of real YouTube users and asked them to install a browser-based plugin, which allowed us to download the list of videos that they were being recommended in real time. And so you can sort of think of these people in a way as Confederates in an audit experiment. We asked them to participate with this plugin installed, and then we experimentally manipulated their time on YouTube in order to isolate the influence of the recommendation algorithm. And so we did this by first randomly assigning these participants to start on a certain seed video. So we randomly assigned them to start on one of 15 seed videos about either politics or sports or music. And then we asked them to click on the video. The plugin then downloaded the list of recommendations they were being actually shown. And then we said, okay, please only click on the nth recommendation in this list, right? And that request was also randomly assigned. So for example, if we said you have a rule of 2, that meant that this participant would always click on the second video, regardless of what it was, and they couldn't pick and choose based on their preference. So we then asked them to do this 20 times, sort of stepping through just following the recommendations 20 times. Each time we were downloading what they were being shown on each video. And then we asked them at the end of this task, after we collected these data, to then fill out a very short survey. And so this larger experiment was in the field, starting in September. But between the end of October and the end of our time collecting these data, we also asked these people questions about their beliefs about the 2020 US presidential election. We would ask them, on a scale of 0 to 100, how concerned are you that fraudulent ballots are being counted or that illegal immigrants are voting? We asked them all of these different sort of parts of this growing conservative Trump-driven narrative of election fraud. And so this was really, the hard part of the work. When we finally then collected the data and looked at it, we simply asked, for those people who were more concerned, these people who we think of as sort of more susceptible or vulnerable to these narratives of election fraud, were they being shown more videos? Were they being recommended more content about election fraud? And so what we found is yes, right? Between the least concerned and the most concerned participants, there's a roughly 200% difference in terms of the number of videos about election fraud that they were being shown. But we think of that as like a statistician, we think of that as a very large coefficient. But at the same time, when we actually count these up, it's a difference between sort of 4 recommendations for the least concerned and 12 on average for the most concerned. And this is out of, over the course of this task, this is out of roughly 400 total recommendations. So our result is a little bit mixed. On the one hand, we do find, contrary to a growing consensus, I think, that the independent influence of the recommendation algorithm is real. It was able to cater to the pre-existing beliefs of these participants. But at the same time, the overall prevalence of this type of content was very scarce in our data. Yeah, so that's the long and short of it.
Thanks, Jim. So what do these findings mean for the debates around filter bubbles and echo chambers, especially in the context of how scarce the pattern you found was?
Yeah, I think I'm going to try and answer that in 2 ways. So first, speaking directly to the academic research, like I say, there's been this growing consensus that, first of all, like you mentioned in your intro, filter bubbles, echo chambers, misinformation, things that we consider to be harmful online phenomena in aggregate are rare. And where we do find them, the existing research has suggested we find them due to human behavior. People are self-selecting into these environments. And sort of this is a part of a growing consensus that, the algorithms don't really matter. They're not really what's driving this. And so our finding of this 200% difference pushes back on that a little bit, argues that in this particular context, there is evidence that the algorithm itself, right? We isolated just the algorithm through this data collection procedure. The algorithm actually is putting its finger on the scale somewhat. But, in terms of sort of the substantive effects, 8 more videos about election fraud is very, very small in terms of how many total recommendations our participants were being shown. And we think of the task that we gave them to be sort of on the high end of how real people do use YouTube, right? I would think most people don't click 20 times through recommendations, but they certainly, or at least I certainly click through several. But 8 out of 400 total videos, it's hard to imagine this changing anyone's mind, for example, right? It's hard to imagine this pushing someone over the edge to go participate in the January 6th protests. And so, yeah, I would say, I think I'm very excited by our work and our findings, but I do think that I caution against over-interpreting the substantive implications of them.
Perfect. Thanks, Jim. Moving on to the next paper is by Sophia Moskalenko, Naama, Juncal, Fernández-Garayzábal, González, and Mia Bloom. It's titled Predictors of Radical Intentions Among Incels, a survey of 54 self-identified incels. To answer questions about this work, we have lead author Sophia Moskalenko, psychologist at Georgia State University. Hey, Sophia, could you tell us a little bit about your study of incels and what you found?
Yes, thank you. So this study reports on the results of a survey we did with these individuals who self-identified as incels, which is it stands for involuntarily celibate. It's an online community of mostly men who feel that they've been unfairly kept out of the dating market, and their ability to develop sexual relationships has been compromised by feminism and what they see as impossible standards for male physical attractiveness and financial abilities. And this grievance has in the past led several incels to commit mass murder attacks. They've left behind manifestos where they outlined their justification for these and called on others to follow suit. So naturally, incels became a concern for the security community and also for the general public. The issue, though, is that incels are rather reclusive. It's hard to get them to talk to scientists. And so this study is one of the few studies that actually researched incels directly instead of, let's say, taking a sample of their postings online and so on. We were interested in three things specifically. We were interested in radicalization among incels, so how many of them endorse violent and illegal political action. We were also interested in how radicalization might be predicted by incel commitment to their ideology, which is called the black pill. And third, we were interested in measuring the rate of mental health issues, which has been identified persistently as kind of accompanying this incel phenomenon. And so we found some interesting things. One was that there are very few participants in our study who endorsed any rate of radical intention or attitudes. Most people in the study scored on the lowest point on the Likert 5-point Likert scale that measured radical attitudes and intentions. There was a small minority who did endorse radical intentions. And another interesting thing was that as far as the relationship between ideology and radicalization among incels, we found zero correlation between these two. In fact, what did predict ideological commitments among incels was not radical intentions, not violent or illegal attitudes, but rather activist intentions, which is to say, those incels who really strongly endorse incel ideology are committed to nonviolent and legal ways of changing political system in the society. We did find a very high prevalence of mental health issues among incels. Most of our participants reported either self-reported or diagnosed or both depression, anxiety, and autism spectrum at a rates that far exceed those in the general population, which is something that's been reported by other people as well. And so I think the study opens some interesting possibilities for prevention and for identification of individuals vulnerable to incel radicalization in these online circles, and for offering to them, help they might need as far as mental health or something like that.
Thanks, Sophia. One thing I really appreciate about this study was the recruiting approach that you took to reach a hard-to-reach group. How do you think that method could be applied to study other uncommon yet consequential groups? And do you have any suggestions for researchers who might pursue such studies?
Yeah, so as I said, incels are not really thrilled about contributing to the scientific knowledge about them. And so the way the study came about was it was a collaboration between the Incel podcast, which is run by the second author, Naama, and it covers issues that are of interest to incels, and it's frequented by them, and they often get in touch with the podcast producer. So the podcast teamed up with a US-based nonprofit organization called Parallel Networks that provides programming that is designed to reduce hate and violence and radicalization. And so incels who contacted the podcast were then invited to get in touch with Parallel Networks. And if they did, they were directed to the online survey, which would serve as a baseline assessment for whatever programming that they might receive. So access is an important issue. And I think it's very important to talk to people directly, especially with their online presence, not often accurately representing their opinions. There's some people who are just lurkers. There are some people who are very vocal, but they're a minority. And so finding these, non-orthodox ways of getting to these communities is a challenge, but I think it's one that we should be investing in.
I definitely agree. Thank you, Sophia. I'll pass things over to Shelby Grossman now for the next two papers. Shelby, please take it away.
Thanks. So next up, we have a paper by Matt Katsaros, Tom Tyler, Jisoo Kim, and Tracy Mears titled Procedural Justice and Self-Governance on Twitter, Unpacking the Experience of Rule Breaking on Twitter. And we have with us Matt Katsaros, who is the lead author and director of the Social Media Governance Initiative at the Justice Laboratory at Yale Law School. I love this paper. It leverages internal Twitter data to look at the correlates of recidivism among rule breakers on Twitter. It's super cool. I strongly recommend checking it out. So Matt, could you tell us a little bit about the survey and the behavioral data that you used and what you found in this study?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Let me start by setting up the motivation for this study. So deterrence, where platforms punish and sanction kind of bad actors who violate rules, is a dominant approach for managing unwanted content and behaviors across lots of online platforms. We were interested in exploring whether a procedural justice approach, one which focuses on the process and the fairness through which content moderation decisions are made and communicated to users, would be an effective approach to managing these problems. So in collaboration with Twitter, we ran a survey to better understand the experience of people who create tweets that violate Twitter's rules. And we asked them how they experience Twitter's enforcement process. We then paired those survey responses with log data on participants' rule violations in the 6 months leading up to the survey and 3 months following the survey. To be eligible for our survey, participants had to have recently violated one of Twitter's 3 rules: hateful conduct, abusive behavior, or promoting suicide and self-harm. While these 3 are just a subset of the full Twitter rules, according to Twitter's transparency reports, they count for about 64% of all accounts actioned, 25% of all accounts suspended, and 74% of all content removed during the second half of 2020. In total, we had about 10,000 respondents to our survey. And some of our first findings were about rule awareness and familiarity. So when we asked people, does Twitter have any rules about appropriate behavior on the platform? 10% of our respondents said no. Of those that were actually aware of rules, 20% said that they had never actually read them. So taken together, these findings indicate an opportunity for platforms to provide some better education and kind of socialization of the rules, especially for those that are breaking them. Next, we asked participants to select from a list describing why they posted the violating tweet. And the answer options that we provided were derived from a lot of qualitative research interviews that we had done prior to this survey. And what we found was that there were actually a pretty wide range of motivations and circumstances that led to these rule violations. For some people, they just thought what they posted was appropriate and kind of normal behavior on the platform, or that they had actually seen others post something similar or something identical. 10% of our respondents said that they just lost their temper. And actually only a small percent of respondents reported having any malicious intent, like wanting to hurt someone or benefit financially. We think having a more nuanced insight into these different pathways to rule violations can really help platforms be much more creative about designing upstream interventions, like perhaps helping people reconsider when they're about to tweet something impulsively, or perhaps reconsidering the enforcement flow itself. Perhaps, for some of these circumstances, they might be better handled with education about platform norms and things like that. Lastly, we asked people about their experience with the platform process and looked at the correlation between those responses and people's likelihood to break rules again in the 3 months following our survey. Using a procedural justice framework to focus on these perceptions of fairness, we asked questions like, I understand why Twitter asked me to remove my tweet, and Twitter gave me an opportunity to express my point of view. Using logistic regression, controlling for participants' demographics and their violation history in the 6 months leading up to the survey, we see that people who were more fairly treated or who felt more fairly treated were more likely to follow Twitter's rules in the 3 months after the survey. This finding was consistent with prior work and shows strong support for a procedural justice approach. It's also worth noting in this regression, a question asking whether or not people agreed with Twitter's decision to remove their tweet was not significantly correlated to recidivism. That is, people's evaluation of the fairness of the process was actually distinct from their evaluations of the outcome itself. There were also some questions asking about how participants valued free speech and safety on the platform, which I encourage you to dig into the paper and read more about. I guess to sum things up, we really think these results demonstrate an opportunity to pay more attention to the process through which platforms are enforcing rules and communicating them to users. In doing so, we expect a higher level of self-governance and rule following across the platform.
Yeah, this is such a neat data set and super interesting findings. So one of the reasons, we were really excited about this paper is because it's an example of academic industry collaboration. And I think academic industry collaborations often provide a rare look at data that can be very hard to otherwise obtain. So I was wondering if you have any lessons learned that might be valuable to other people who are seeking out these kinds of collaborations.
Totally. Yeah, this is something I spend a lot of time thinking about. It's something over the past 5 years, I've been spending a lot of time trying to foster these collaborations, both working inside some of these companies at different points in time, and now my work at the Justice Collaboratory. And something I've learned is in some cases, the most successful approach is really to treat the relationship or treat the collaboration as a relationship and something that's built on trust that happens over time instead of some sort of kind of transactional relationship. Sometimes that means starting with something that doesn't look like publishing a paper, like just giving a talk to a team that's interested in your ideas. And it can be important to not be too tied to any specific outcome of the collaboration, but instead just try to work with teams that are interested in your ideas and try and find overlapping, goals and commitment to a shared process. And at the risk of sounding too cheesy, I would turn to procedural justice for what that process looks like. It means treating people with respect, being transparent and consistent, providing each other voice, and having trustworthy motives. Of course, persistence and patience are also pretty crucial. There's just a lot more stakeholders and people involved in the projects. But I think for most people who are going through the publishing process, patience is probably something they're pretty well practiced at already. So those are all my tips.
Awesome, super helpful. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah.
Okay, so last up, we have a paper by Jeff Lees, Abigail McCarter, and Don M. Sarno titled "Twitter's Disputed Tags May Be Ineffective at Reducing Belief in Fake News and Only Reduce Intentions to Share Fake News Among Democrats and Independents." And to answer questions today, we have with us Jeff Lees, who is an associate research scholar at the Behavioral Science for Policy Lab at Princeton. So this is also a really cool paper because it attempts to measure the effect of something that Twitter did by running an online survey experiment, kind of simulating what it's like to be looking at Twitter content. So Jeff, to start, do you want to tell us a little bit about the really neat experiment you ran and what you found?
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me. So let me talk about the motivation for this research. So at the time, Twitter was still using their now memeified disputed tag, famously attached to some of Trump's tweets about the election, and used throughout late 2020 and early 2021. And at the time we ran this experiment, it was still in use, although now Twitter has transitioned to other types of misinformation tags, and they don't use the term disputed anymore. And so we were coming from a growing body of research suggesting that what we call accuracy nudges are effective tools for reducing belief in sharing and misinformation. And an accuracy nudge is what it sounds like. It's just something in the environment. It can literally be like, hey, just remember to think about the truthfulness of something you're reading online. It's something that cues people away from this sort of like hot cognition, I'm going to share this thing because it's funny, towards the cold cognition, wait a minute, let me just think for like 2 seconds about whether this tweet suggesting that Hillary Clinton got drunk the night of 2016 election, which is an actual tweet we use because it was a real piece of fake news. Is that real? It's probably not real. That's the idea of an accuracy nudge. And there's a lot of research showing that these accuracy nudges are quite effective. And so what we wanted to do is ask, do these disputed tags functions as effective accuracy nudges? And that's what we predicted. We actually pre-registered multiple hypotheses, which in general said these will work like accuracy nudges should. They should reduce belief and sharing intentions of tweets that they are attached to, and they should be largely driven by variance in people's levels of reflectiveness, which we measured in the survey, and it shouldn't be determined by people's politics, which is a lot of what the past research has suggested, that this is not about political bias, it's just about reflectiveness. And there was one other thing we wanted to do in this survey, which was simulate an actual Twitter environment a little better than past research has. So a lot of research, not all of it, but a lot of research takes the classic A/B test design. Half the people get A, let's say it's a tweet without a tag. Half people get B, a tweet with a tag, and you compare. What we did is we actually did A, B, and C all together. So participants saw a stream of tweets, one at a time, and the tweet was either true, like something that we confirmed that was true, false, like a real piece of fake news really actually used in the past, or 3, false with a tag. So we had true, false without a tag, and false with a tag. And everyone saw all of them, which allows us to actually compare between all of them. So how do people react to false versus true? But also, how do people react to true without a tag, false without a tag, and false with a tag? Importantly, the order of all these tweets were completely randomized by participant, and which of the false tweets got the tag or didn't was also randomized. So that allows us to control for the political content of the tweets, which we did, and other factors, and really get at the basic judgments that people made. And what we found, contrary to our hypotheses, was that the tags do not reduce belief. So people, relative to the false tweets without tags and false tweets with tags, there's no difference in belief. And there was a difference in sharing intention. We did see the anticipated accuracy nudge effect. When a tweet had a tag on it, people were less likely to share it, less likely to say they would share it. But that was only true for Democrats and Republicans. And we actually found this consistent pattern where, contrary to our prediction, people's level of cognitive reflectiveness was not predictive of their responding, but their political ideology was. And this is the benefit of this design. For false untagged tweets and for true tweets, ideology never predicted responding, either belief or sharing intentions. But in the presence of a tag, ideology suddenly becomes a predictor, where conservatives are more likely to believe, liberals are less likely to believe, and more likely to share, less likely to share. And so that was not predicted. And we spent time thinking about what this means. This is arguably an artifact of the design in the sense that we tried to create something a little more realistic to Twitter, right? Because when people see a disputed tag in the wild, it's always going to be in a stream of other tweets. And so we tried to replicate that a little better than the classic A/B design. But I think also there's a reasonable inference here that the Twitter's disputed tags have become polarized, that conservatives interpreted them as being anti-conservative and liberals interpreted them as being pro-liberal. And that's why we see all of these behavior differences or attribution differences in the presence of a tag versus when there's no tag, but the information is still false.
Yeah, I think it's super important to look at how different, how people with different kind of partisan affiliations respond to these kinds of interventions. Really neat. So given your findings, how should online platforms think about designing interventions in the future?
That's a great question. You know, in order to be intellectually honest, right, we did not anticipate this finding. And so I think there's a lot more research has to be done. One thing I've been often asked is, does this constitute a backfire effect, right? There's not clear evidence for that. The evidence is sort of, in my data, the evidence is sort of mixed as to whether the presence of the tag is really, like a backfire effect would be, for example, a subpopulation, say conservatives, being more likely to believe something that's false versus when a tag's on it versus when it's not. And we don't find that directly. The data suggests it's actually more just driven by Democrats and independents being less likely to believe it. But there needs to be more data on this because, again, we pre-registered a bunch of hypotheses based on past findings. And when you don't replicate past findings, there's a lot of things that can be going on. But I think the most conservative inference is that these tags have become politicized. And so if I were thinking about this from Twitter's perspective, you know, it might suggest that Twitter's sort of forward-facing misinformation policies might not be effective for the population they want them to be effective for the most, which is Republicans and people who are highly politically engaged, who are more likely to share misinformation relative to the rest of the population. So if Twitter's sort of public behavior is becoming politicized, that means that when people see these tags, they're not interacting with cognitive mechanisms like reflectiveness, they're interacting with ideology. And so doing more research, that's always, it's always a self-serving suggestion, but from Twitter's perspective, it might be better maybe to think about how these can be done in a way that aren't tied to Twitter, how more trusted third parties could be allowed to lead some of these efforts about reducing misinformation. Because as I mentioned, there's a lot of research suggesting that when these accuracy nudges aren't politicized, they work just as effective on Democrats and Republicans across the board. And so it could be that Twitter's disputed tags just don't work, and Twitter has moved away from them. Twitter didn't give a lot of reasons as to why they moved away from disputed tags, but one of them was over concerns of backfire effects. So it's possible that Twitter's new tags could be more effective, right? It could just be the word disputed. That just might be a confusing word. That might be why we find our effects and why they changed. But really starting to think about that relationship between the trust in the platform, right? Are people actually trusting these disputed tags, and who's not trusting them? And if the people not trusting them are the people you really want to get to, then maybe finding a source which people trust is going to be more effective.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Jeff. So I'm going to pass things over to Dan to wrap up, who is going to give us a sneak peek at some of our journal statistics. So we're going to be announcing lots of journal statistics at the Trust and Safety Research Conference later this month, but Dan's going to provide a sneak peek. And I'll just note that as a journal, we really prioritize being transparent about what our process is like and how long it takes, so that people can make an informed decision when deciding about whether to submit to the journal. So Dan, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. That was a phenomenal round of talks. Yeah, so now's the time where we pitch submitting to the journal. I see a lot of familiar faces in attendance. I see a lot of names from academia, from trust and safety teams. We would love to look at any of the work that you are doing. I've pasted into the chat the submission guidelines, so you can go ahead and take a look at that. Our next deadline is October 31st of this year. And I just wanted to share some of the statistics to kind of ground where we're coming from. We started this journal as an open access, fast publishing journal. And what do we mean by fast? We respond to authors' letters of interest, usually within 5 days of getting it. So 4 to 5 days, you can expect to hear back from us about your letter of inquiry. From there, once we've sent it out to review, it takes about roughly a month for us to get back to you with reviewer feedback and our first decision. And then looking at the conference proceedings issue, which is the one that's going to accompany the Trust and Safety Research Conference, we received about 28 inquiries. That includes letters of inquiry, articles, commentaries, and we sent to review about 8 of those. So that's about a third of all submitted articles. So really, you can expect to be treated well here at the journal. We'll send out the articles pretty fast and get reviews back to you fast as well. I think this really benefits the field of trust and safety as a whole. We want to make sure that the newest research is out there as soon as possible, just like we've seen with today's special issue. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Go ahead, check out the articles again on tsjournal.org and sign up for our mailing list as well. Thanks.